Hello and welcome to Mystic Dog Mama, the podcast for soul-led dog mamas, where you'll discover how to best nourish your dog and yourself, mind, body, and soul. I'm your host, Dr. Alexia Miller. Hello. Thanks for joining me today. I'm so happy that you're here. This episode is a special bonus episode that I created after a listener got in touch asking if I'd speak a little bit more about Lucky's journey. We were chatting on Instagram, and she wanted to hear more specifically about the progress that I've made with some of Lucky's behaviors and how he's made some huge leaps and bounds recently with getting a bit more comfortable with things that used to really frighten him. So I sat down and did some reflection on what I think has worked, what hasn't worked, and what we're still working through, in hopes that perhaps you might benefit from some of my successes, as well as learn from my failures. I want to start this whole conversation by prefacing the fact that I'm not a veterinarian, nor am I a trainer, nor am I a behaviorist. So this is by no means a professional opinion or substitute for professional care. If you're having issues with your dog, I always recommend consulting your holistic veterinarian or a positive reinforcement professional as your first port of call. This is simply me sharing my experience with Lucky, and so take what resonates and leave what doesn't. It's also just a snapshot of where Lucky and I are at the time of this recording, because I'm constantly evolving my thinking and approaches as I learn more, and especially as I interview our amazing guests who always leave me with food for thought. Some of the things I'm going to share with you will be techniques, some will be equipment, some will be diet, and others will be new perspectives that helped create change. I'm hoping that giving you this fuller picture will be helpful as you explore what might be useful in your particular circumstances with your pup. Okay, on that note, let's get started. If you've listened to previous episodes, you'll know that Lucky came to me when he was 12 weeks old, just as we were going down into hard lockdown during the COVID-19 pandemic. A neighbor asked if I could foster him since his owner was traveling back home to be with his family during the lockdown and couldn't take Lucky with him. I was certainly not expecting to have a dog, but here I was, gifted with the opportunity to take care of this little munchkin, seemingly out of nowhere. I say seemingly because, as you'll know from those previous episodes, I was told shortly before Lucky came to me by a local curandero that I needed to be on the lookout for dogs and cats crossing my path because they're healers for me. So I wasn't completely surprised that he literally showed up with a knock on my door. However, I certainly didn't expect him to show up at that time or that way, so I wasn't exactly prepared. Like many of you have probably done with your own dogs when you first brought them home, after cuddling with this new bundle of love, reality kind of set in, and I immediately started Googling what on earth to do with a new puppy, how to feed a new puppy, how to train a new puppy. I honestly don't think I've ever spent as much time on YouTube as I have since Lucky came into my life. I had absolutely no idea what I was doing, and I had no idea where to start. I also had this ideal image in my head of what a dog might look like for me in my life, and I quickly came to realize that this idealized image just was not happening. Can you relate to this? I'm going to talk a bit about this somewhat chronologically, but I'm also going to jump around a little bit to help connect some of the dots, because the reality is life just isn't linear. We come to different levels of understanding that help us look back and make connections that we didn't see at the time. I'm also going to be talking about specific quote-unquote issues that I've had with Lucky, but it's important to understand that things just don't exist in a vacuum, but rather everything exists within an interconnected constellation. I'll be drawing parallels and making connections between things that I didn't see at first. And in doing so, I'm hoping that it helps you to take a different look at your own situation with your dog and see it in a different light, in case that opens up something for you that you might not have noticed otherwise. Okay, so a bit of Lucky's backstory that I think is relevant, and I'll explain why in a second. Firstly, Lucky is a Chihuahua mix, so I'm not discounting breed tendencies that have affected his behaviors, But I'm also wanting to look beyond the tendency to just boil things down to, oh, he's a Chihuahua and that's what they do. You'll hear in an upcoming interview I did with applied ethologist, behavior consultant, and dog trainer Kim Brophy that yes, breed does have an impact on how a dog engages with his world. But we also need to consider a whole heap of other factors that require us to look at the individual dog in front of us. In Lucky's case, one of these individualized factors was the fact that Lucky's mother was hit by a car and killed when he and his sibling were just 2 weeks old. Lucky witnessed the accident. Now, some people will say, and have actually said to me, that that doesn't matter, that dogs don't remember those things, that I'm just anthropomorphizing him. I 100% disagree. More and more studies are showing that dogs experience post-traumatic stress disorder in a similar way to humans. PTSD impacts the nervous system and affects the way that the dog or the human interprets the world around them. Dogs can experience episodes of panic, fearfulness, and even aggression as a result of PTSD, just like humans do. And Lucky absolutely began to display these behaviors that we often term quote-unquote reactive, which I'll get into. In addition, it's important to remember that puppies learn from their mother and their litter mates things like bite inhibition and just how to be a dog. Lucky missed out on these key social elements. On top of that, losing his mother at such a young age meant that he was not receiving his mother's milk. His owner did the absolute best that he could, and I'm truly so grateful for all the steps that he took to care for Lucky. But he fed the puppies bread soaked in cow's milk because he thought that that was the best thing to do. When they were able to eat solid food, the puppies were put on a lower-end kibble. Again, this is no judgment whatsoever, because he really was doing the absolute best that he could with the best of intentions. I'm just putting the pieces together to get a better understanding of the puzzle. Now, if you listen to the episode where veterinarian Dr. Odette Suter talks about the importance of microbiome health, you'll remember that she said building the microbiome from a very young age is important for the dog's long-term overall health. We also know from numerous studies that gut health has a direct impact on behavior. So between losing out on the nutrition from his mother's milk and then eating a species inappropriate diet with the bread and milk and then the carb-laden kibble, we can only assume that Lucky did not have the best microbiome health. I'll come back to this later, but I wanted to bring it up because, for example, even though you may have an issue with your dog's reactivity and your primary mode of addressing it may be exactly what most of us turn to, which is training and behavior modification, I also want to suggest that looking a little bit deeper in a place that you might not have ever considered might be the missing link, or at least one of them. Okay, so back to Lucky. Not only did Lucky lose his mom and not have the best nutritional start, he was then placed in a new home with me and my mom, and add to this growing mix of elements, Lucky is what has been termed a pandemic pup, and experienced full lockdown during his peak socialization window of 12 to 16 weeks of age. This is when it's often advised to expose your puppy in a safe way and at a pace that the puppy is comfortable with to a variety of different stimuli, environments, and situations in order to help build their confidence with new things. The fact that Lucky missed out on experiencing the world at this critical time in his development led him to being afraid of virtually everything. When I was first able to take him out for a walk, he was in utter panic mode. I mean, crying, shaking, and crawling up my leg. It didn't help that a boisterous off-lead German Shepherd puppy ran up to us and started play-biting Lucky. That has set up a pairing in Lucky's mind to this day with large dogs equaling danger. And honestly, who can blame him? I also think it's important to mention that there was a lot of fear, anxiety, anger, frustration, and a whole heap of other intense emotions flying around during the COVID lockdown period. If we were feeling it, our dogs were feeling it too. Regardless of how you felt on a personal level, at a collective level, there was definitely an energy in the air, and our dogs were also experiencing it. Okay, so now that I've set the scene a bit, I'll share some of the quote-unquote issues that started to creep up. I say issues in air quotes because I've been really challenging myself to reframe the way that I talk about and think about the behaviors that I've identified as problems because they made me or others uncomfortable, in favor of labeling them more as Lucky just trying to communicate his feelings and needs in ways that I didn't necessarily understand or know how to support at the time. I'm still learning how to do both of these things, but the reframing part is crucial to how things have changed with Lucky. The first major issue I encountered with Lucky was severe and ongoing gastrointestinal issues. Now, you might be wondering what this has to do with the behavior issues I'm going to be talking about, but you'll see in a second. Once I adopted Lucky and felt able to begin making decisions about what I was feeding him, I switched him to a higher quality kibble and began adding fresh food toppers that I found recommended from various Google searches. But about 1 month after I switched him to an adult formula of the same brand of puppy kibble that I'd been feeding him, the issues really accelerated. This particular blend used chickpeas as the primary protein source. Now, not every dog is going to react the same way, which is also why I'm a huge proponent of feeding the dog in front of you. However, this switch triggered an absolute tsunami for us. Lucky was vomiting and had diarrhea multiple times a day. I would take him to the vet, who would give him some anti-nausea drugs, and then the whole thing started again. Lucky would eat the fresh toppers I was giving him, but refused the kibble. I tried every imaginable kibble, and it was always the same result. If he would eat it, he would be sick and have diarrhea. My vet suggested I start making his food, which is what launched me into the canine nutrition world. When I first started making his fresh food, I was using chicken and beef as his main proteins, because that's what I had access to. After a while, the second issue cropped up. Although we weren't seeing the same GI issues, one day I came home and Lucky was growling, showing teeth and aggressing whenever I touched him, and then it escalated to whenever I came anywhere near him. I had never seen this before, and I was really scared at what was happening. I called my vet immediately, and she wasn't sure what was wrong, but knew that he was obviously in pain and gave him some painkillers. He was fine for a few days, then it started again. I was literally at the vet clinic every few days. We ran blood work, and his bun levels were slightly elevated, possibly indicating a kidney issue, so she suggested putting him on Azadil, which is essentially a probiotic to help break down toxins in the gut in order to create a lesser burden on the kidneys. We also ran some food allergy tests to the most common allergens like chicken and beef and wheat, etc., and Lucky didn't show any sign of allergies. As a side note, dogs that are fed fresh food tend to have slightly higher bun levels than what is considered the normal range because they consume more protein than kibble-fed dogs. And those ranges that were used for the testing were based on testing kibble-fed dogs. I didn't know this at the time, so I didn't question the diagnosis of kidney issues. I just wanted to make you aware in case you've had a similar situation. I also noticed at this time, though, that Lucky was chewing on his ankles a lot. Now, if you listen to the episodes on reflexology with Vivian Beerley, you'll know that it was this chewing that helped me to piece together some of the things that were going on with Lucky. I came across Vivian's video on reflexology and dogs' anal glands. She was demonstrating the acupressure point linked to the anal glands, and that was the exact spot that Lucky was chewing. Lucky naturally and instinctively knew where to put pressure. Just like when we've got a headache, we often put pressure next to our eyes on the bridge of our nose, which is an acupressure point for relieving headaches. This is the benefit of taking a wider, more holistic approach to what is going on with our dogs and with ourselves. Even though Lucky wasn't showing any of the other common signs of anal gland issues like scooting, I spoke with my vet again about the possibility of the pain he was experiencing being a result of blocked anal glands. And so she manually expressed them and saw they were completely full. Once she expressed them, he was fine for another 10 days or so, but it would start again. And Lucky demonstrated the same aggressive behavior of snapping, snarling, and growling to keep me and others away. So I put my little researcher hat on again and started to look into various natural remedies for anal glands and came across homeopathy and the use of silica to help release blocked anal glands. I brought it up to my vet, who agreed we could try it, and she suggested that I speak with the homeopath in town to see if he could supply me with some silica. Stick with me, I'm bringing some things together for you, I promise, and I think you might have some aha moments of your own just from this alone. The homeopath asked me what I wanted the silica for, and keep in mind, I was having to do all of this in my limited Spanish. I began to explain that it was for my dog, and that my vet sent me to him because my dog had blocked anal glands. So just picture me having to try and think of what the word for anal glands would be in Spanish off the top of my head. And let me tell you, no Spanish class I ever took prepared me for this kind of conversation. Thank goodness the doctor was an absolute sweetheart and very patient with me. He then asked me to sit on the examination table, and he wanted to use me as a surrogate to do some muscle testing on Lucky. If you're not familiar with this, the concept of muscle testing is based on the fact that the subconscious mind knows exactly what's going on and basically can't lie. When we tap into the subconscious, we can use the body's muscles to establish a yes and no response to questions. It's possible to do this as a proxy or a surrogate for someone else, including your pet. So the homeopath took my heels in each of his hands and started to quickly balance them, like in a juggling motion. He was saying things almost under his breath, and I figured out he was doing testing using the emotion code. If you've never heard of the emotion code, it's a modality created by Dr. Bradley Nelson that uses the subconscious's awareness of emotions that are trapped in the body. My mom trained in it, and so I was familiar with it and recognized it immediately. He also started listing off a variety of different foods, again in a whisper. At the end of our session, the doctor told me that he picked up on the fact that Lucky was holding on to fear and abandonment, which are associated with the kidneys. Remember his elevated bun levels? I'm not saying the emotions cause this, but I definitely think it's interesting that the doctor picked up on this. He also told me that Lucky was still dealing with GI distress, and that part of the issue with his anal glands was that he has a chicken intolerance. I told him that we'd done a blood test for chicken allergies and that it had come back negative. The doctor then went on to explain to me how an intolerance is not a true allergy, and so it doesn't show up on an allergy test. But due to Lucky's compromised GI system, remember that weak microbiome that I mentioned earlier? He potentially had leaky gut, which was what has led to him developing an intolerance to chicken. And guess what is often a symptom of food intolerance? That's right, blocked anal glands. I went home with some homeopathic remedies for Lucky's GI distress, switched his foods to eliminate all chicken, and within a couple of weeks, I started to see real improvement. I went from every 5 to 10 days going to the vet with my poor dog screaming in pain, growling like a demon, to no anal gland issues. But to be totally transparent, Lucky still chews on his ankles at times, and so I know that I still need to tweak his diet for where he is right now, and potentially the things that he's exposed to in his environment. That's a bit of a trial and error process, but he is doing so much better, and we don't have the constant distress that he used to experience. I've chosen to support Lucky by making him a DIY, raw, and gently cooked diet, which means that I'm putting all of the pieces together myself versus buying a pre-made meat, organ, bone mix from a company. And this just makes it so much easier for me to be able to do elimination diets and also to isolate ingredients so that I can get a better sense of how he tolerates different foods. I definitely recommend this approach if you have a dog with sensitivities and you're willing to put a bit of time into it, because it makes life so much easier if your dog has a reaction to be able to identify what triggered it. The reason I've spent a fair amount of time sharing this part of Lucky's story with you is that when dogs present undesirable behavior, there's often the tendency, like I mentioned, to go straight to training or behavior modification. But I think it's really important to also consider the possibility that the dog is experiencing pain or discomfort, or that their microbiome is out of whack. This is why I always ask about pain or sudden changes in behavior when I'm doing my nutrition consultations. Because if we're in pain or have gastric distress, our behavior is affected, and the same is true of our dogs. Now, speaking of triggers, I wanted to move on to the next major overarching issue that I've had with Lucky and how we've approached it, and that is quote-unquote reactivity. Again, air quotes, because if you listen to my conversation with Dr. Laura Donaldson, she reminds us that there are no nuisance behaviors, only behaviors that we don't understand. And I couldn't agree more with this. So as I mentioned, Lucky had a rough start in life. He's also an incredibly sensitive dog. He's sensitive to noises, smells, textures, my emotions, and he's even sensitive to where his food and water bowls are placed. When he's presented with anything new, he's really wary and needs some time to feel comfortable with it, including new foods. So there was a lot for me to learn. But to kind of categorize things, I was most concerned about Lucky's tendency to bark and lunge at other dogs and people, even if the dogs and people were 100 feet away. In Mexico, people would comment that he was bravo, meaning that he's angry or aggressive. I would always correct them and say, no es bravo, es que él tiene miedo. He's not aggressive, he's afraid. But that would be met with laughter or just scoffing, but it's the absolute truth. And I feel like I have to advocate for him and plant the seed in those people's minds that there might be a different way of looking at the situation and judging what's going on. Lucky is a Chihuahua, like I mentioned, and although I've often heard people say that small dogs get away with this bad behavior because people think it's cute, I can absolutely say that for Lucky, a big part of his reactivity is a result of being a small dog and having everything in his world being bigger than he is. It's also a result of him being attacked multiple times by off-leash large dogs, so he's had that fear reinforced. Truth be told, I didn't always have the sensitivity that I do now to his size and what that's meant for his experience of the world. In all honesty, when Lucky first demonstrated barking and lunging, I was scared, embarrassed, and ashamed that I didn't have control of the situation and that I was really hurt by other people's cruel comments. I took it as a personal failure, and I was also exhausted at having to be on constant alert for the next trigger every time we walked out the door. Who out there can relate to this? One of the biggest lessons I've learned through this has been that in many cases, it's my job to adjust. Not necessarily Lucky's, and definitely not other people's. And that as a result of me adjusting my expectations or the situations I put him in, Lucky's behavior, which is his reactions to the situations that I'm putting him in, naturally starts to adjust. When Lucky's barking and lunging at triggers first started, I did the classical attempts to desensitize him and counter-condition this behavior. We'd stay at a distance wherever possible, and I'd reward him for any glimmer of a break in between barking with a yes and a treat. We did the whole process of getting a bit closer to the triggers as he was comfortable and rewarding from there, rewarding when he would disengage and look at me, all the typical things we're taught in positive reinforcement training. I even introduced the word friend to him to try and let him know that the person or dog approaching was safe. And sometimes this works, and sometimes it doesn't, and we have to go back a few steps. I still use all these positive reinforcement training techniques because they can and do help. In hindsight, though, I realized that perhaps the biggest issue was that I entered the process with a really unfair agenda, and that was I wanted to fix Lucky's behavior. I wanted to get rid of it. Everything that I was doing, even though it was the right thing, was 100% aimed at changing him. Now, you might be saying, yeah, that's the point of all that, right? To stop him barking and lunging? Well, again, yes and no. With the knowledge and awareness that I have now about dogs and energy, again, check out my conversation with Caroline Griffith on the canine flow process if you haven't already and are interested in knowing a bit more about what I'm talking about. What would have been more helpful is if I had gone into working with Lucky's behavior with more of a curiosity and less of a, for the love of God, please stop being reactive approach. Hands up if you secretly said this too. Everything about my approach, even though it was based on positive reinforcement and fear-free techniques, was screaming, I need you to just stop doing this because I'm uncomfortable with it, because other people are uncomfortable with it, and I feel judged. None of my approaches at that time were actually rooted in deep understanding and accepting the possibility that he might never change his behavior, and that might have to be okay. It was definitely not an option for me at that time. And again, remember that I had a vision of what I wanted life to be like with my dog. So here are some things that have helped and continue to help in no particular order. in the ways that I approach Lucky and what are generally deemed reactive behaviors. First, I'll talk about equipment, training approaches, and modifications that I've made. Some worked really well, others not so much. I walk Lucky using a harness and a 30-foot long line. The harness was a no-brainer for me because I absolutely did not want to be putting pressure on Lucky's neck. However, this long line is by far the best equipment investment I have made. Yes, I even use it on shorter neighborhood walks, and yes, people think it's hilarious that I'm walking a 10-pound chihuahua on such a long leash. But my goodness, has it made a huge difference. Many positive reinforcement trainers advocate for long lines with fearful or reactive dogs, and I have to say that giving Lucky the space he needs to choose to get away from something he's uncomfortable with, as well as giving him the safe space to explore his environment, has been so helpful that I don't think I could ever go back to a short leash. His confidence has grown in knowing he has choice and agency, and honestly, he's so adorable running up and down the sidewalk, sniffing, doing his dog thing, all while I have a safe handle on him so that I can move us out of the way of anything unwanted, or to keep other pedestrians or cyclists safe. It's been invaluable in building up to him being able to be off-leash. It's also been great for teaching him recall skills, and it's something I definitely recommend considering if you aren't already using one with your reactive pup. I've left a link to the one I use with Lucky in the show notes just in case you want to check it out. Along the lines of giving Lucky choice and agency in how he chooses to engage with his environment, I also pay attention as best I can to the specifics of things that he likes and doesn't like. I've come to learn that he's not actually reactive to all dogs, as I had once thought, or rather assumed. He actually does pretty well with smaller dogs that he doesn't know, and he's also pretty happy to check out older dogs that he isn't familiar with. He's also less likely to react aggressively to a dog that circles back by us if I let him sniff where the dog walked after it passes us. This will sound pretty basic to you if you've got a reactive dog, but I noticed how I often assumed that Lucky would be reactive, assumed it would be a tense walk, and then I projected that onto the whole situation. Honestly, going for a walk was turning into a Mission Impossible movie, and I was always so stressed out. Does this sound familiar to you? If it does, I have a fantastic conversation coming up with Nikki French, who created the National Don't Walk Your Dog Day. She has some fantastic tips on rethinking walks and helping your dog deal with the stressors of our everyday lives. As far as Lucky goes, once I realized he was open to some dogs that we would see regularly, I actually approached their owners to see if they might be okay if we walked behind them, and eventually worked up to walking next to them at a bit of a distance, and then in a bit of a pack walk. This built Lucky's and my confidence immensely. If you're able to find some buddies for your dog and for you, I definitely recommend considering this. To see Lucky go from barking his head off at a dog a football field away to waiting for that same dog in a play bow position, excited to go for a walk together, was mind-blowing and heart-opening to say the least. It didn't happen overnight, but it did happen. Another thing that I started a while back and continue today that has been super helpful is to reframe what I think the walk is about and what it should look like, and instead, I let Lucky lead. This is an extension of the Sniffari idea, but I started noticing that Lucky loves being like an old man sitting at benches, watching the world go by. I often joke that he's my granddad reincarnated. He loves to either sit by my feet or on my lap and just watch things. I mean, this dog loves it. At this point, I basically have to spell bench when talking to others because he gets so excited at the mere possibility that we're going to go to one. So sometimes our walks are simply walking to a bench and sitting for an hour. No joke. But it helps Lucky take in his environment and build confidence. And he loves it. And I want him to have experiences doing things that he loves. I also go for walks at unpopular times, as I'm sure many of you do. And here's the kicker. I actually skip the walk sometimes, both for Lucky's sake and for mine. I remember sharing this in a reactive dog Facebook group I was in, and people were like, oh my God, I'd feel so guilty doing that. But I absolutely think it's important to take days off from walking, not only because your dog may have been triggered, but also because you may have been triggered. Again, check out Nikki French's episode on this topic. It's been really helpful for me to check where I'm acting out of conditioning, i.e., you have a dog, therefore you're supposed to walk him 2 to 3 times per day, rather than considering what Lucky or what I really want or need at any given time. The next thing that I found game-changing is diet. As you'll know by now, I'm a huge advocate of fresh food feeding, even if you're only able to add fresh food toppers to your dog's kibble at this point. And I'm also a huge advocate for starting with raw meaty bones where possible. Changing Lucky from a kibble-based to a fresh, species-appropriate diet has massively improved his physical health. I mean, when your dog goes from vomiting or having diarrhea on a near-daily basis to you having to make appointments to see your vet socially because you love her, but your dog is never sick, so you rarely go to her for an issue, I mean, that's incredible. And diet was a huge part of that for Lucky and me. As you'll have heard in my conversation with Kay Stewart, a species-appropriate fresh food diet is more bioavailable, meaning your dog's body can much more easily obtain the nutrients it needs from fresh food, as opposed to ultra-processed kibble and wet food. Like I mentioned before, we know that there's a gut-brain connection, and that diet absolutely has an impact on mood and behavior. I'm not saying that changing Lucky's diet has gotten rid of his reactivity, but what I am saying is that I'm at least setting the stage for him to have a healthier microbiome, and therefore giving him a better chance of experiencing a healthier emotional state. It's important to remember that what we are terming reactive behavior is a symptom of an emotional state. I'm doing everything I can to make sure Lucky is in a good emotional state, and that includes providing him with a nutrient-dense, species-appropriate diet. If you're interested in learning how you might improve your own dog's health by modifying her diet, get in touch with me because I'm offering a limited number of nutrition consultations at a really reduced rate for a limited time as part of a case study in my ongoing professional training in canine nutrition. As part of the consultation, we'll come up with a diet plan based on your dog's individual needs and your situation. And you'll get 2 Zoom calls with me so that I can answer any questions and guide you easily through the process. If this sounds like something you'd like to learn more about, send me a DM on Instagram with the word nutrition, and I'll send you an intake form with all the information. If you're not on Instagram, you can also email me at mysticdogmama@gmail.com. I'll put all of this in the show notes. As another note, I've also seen emotional benefits for Lucky since prioritizing raw meaty bones in his diet. Like Dr. Tom Lonsdale said, raw meaty bones are the key to the carnivore code, and by giving Lucky the opportunity and outlet to express his natural canine behaviors, he is one happy camper. You'll hear me talk more about the topic of honoring and supporting your dog's natural behaviors in upcoming episodes with Kim Brophy and Simona Mueller, but I wanted to mention it here in the context of what I've found has helped Lucky, because really taking stock of his needs and doing my best to honor them has made him much more content, it's strengthened our bond, and it's ultimately made me happier too, because he is fulfilled. That's a win-win in my books. I think it's also important to note that his needs change daily and that I often have to check myself. So finally, in thinking about what has helped Lucky on his journey, I want to talk to you about energy. And this is the part of my approach with Lucky's journey that may be surprising to you, but it's the part that I actually think is the most important for a number of reasons. First of all, everything is energy, so it's at the heart of it all. From a metaphysical perspective, we talk about changing things in the 3D world around us by first changing things at the energetic level. From a more clinical psychological perspective, we know that by changing our emotions, which are energy and motion, we inevitably change behavior. There are a few ways that I incorporate energy into the ways that I engage with Lucky. On the more sacred side of things, I bless Lucky's food and water every day, and I've written the word love on his water bowl. Remember what your grandmother and mother said about their secret ingredient that made their food taste so much better? That's right, love. Now here's the science. Studies are showing that water actually holds and conducts information, or consciousness. Have you seen Dr. Emoto's studies of water crystals that changed according to what was said to it, or words written on the container? Veda Austin is doing some amazing work building on Dr. Emoto's research around water as source, not a resource. So we know at a very real level that our intention, our energy, impacts the world around us. I also really love taking a moment and transforming the simple, mundane act of placing Lucky's food and water out for him into a daily sacred ceremony filled with love. Do I have hard quantitative evidence that this is affecting his behavior? No. But do I need that in order to know that such a beautiful act reinforces my bond with him? Nope. Another way I use energy with Lucky is Reiki. I've always been really open to energy work because, again, everything is energy, and everything in form arises out of energy. I also knew many people who'd experienced Reiki healings, and so I figured I'd try it with Lucky. I started by playing him some Reiki-infused audio tracks and found that he really liked them. He'd get into a really relaxed state, and it's from a relaxed state that the body is able to heal itself. So at the very least, I knew it was relaxing him, if nothing else. But this inspired me to train in Reiki and incorporate it into my own practices for myself, Lucky, and even others. I love to use Reiki to clear my own energy as part of my morning meditation practice, and I often offer it to Lucky. I've also mentioned before that I practice a personal spiritual practice that's based on honoring and aligning with nature and the natural cycles called hedge witchcraft. As part of this, I love to connect with the moon and make moon water, where I invite the wisdom of Grandmother Moon into a jar of water, and I add intentions of love and joy. I use this water to mop my floor, visualizing removing any outdated or unwanted energies in my home, and inviting in divine love. Our intentions are so powerful, and doing this simple practice is such a beautiful way of clearing out energies Lucky and I have outgrown, and inviting in new, loving, and expansive energies. Is there a simple practice that you already do or might like to adopt that allows you to bring focus and attention to how your space feels and consciously cultivating the feelings you want to feel? As I do these kinds of practices, I become more conscious of, more aware of my own personal energy. These practices help me to witness, rather than identify with my changing moods or emotions. And this is incredibly helpful when I find myself triggered or in the midst of having to deal with Lucky's outbursts. I can let strangers' comments go without doing the mental gymnastics I used to do of playing out the scenario over and over, coming up with what I wish I'd said, or feeling like a victim. That's not to say that I'm 100% successful at doing this 100% of the time, but I'm constantly getting better and better at it. And as a result, when I'm more calm and centered within myself, Lucky tends to be calmer and more centered too, because after all, dogs pick up on and mirror our energy. Also, I'm more aware of how energy and emotions flow through me. I'm more aware of how energy and emotional charges flow through Lucky. If you listen to the episode with Caroline Griffith, we talked all about this and how many reactive behaviors are actually just the dog trying to ground its energy. Understanding our dog's need to ground emotional charge can radically change how we view and work with their behaviors. This has invited me to look at Lucky's and my own behaviors with curiosity instead of judgment. I make sure that I'm intentionally offering Lucky multiple ways to ground his energy, whether that's through tug or teaching him to put his paws up on a block like Dr. Laura Donaldson suggests, or doing a treat scatter, or even making sure that I spend time cuddling with him. These are all ways that dogs ground their energy, and I'm much more conscious of this now. I also make sure that I'm grounding my own energy. That might look like meditation, or it might look like spending a few minutes with my hands on the tree in the yard, or visualizing a bubble of white light surrounding us before we go for a walk, or even just mindfully doing the dishes. I've definitely noticed that when I center myself and ground my energy before Lucky and I head out on our walks, he is calmer. I'm calmer. And we handle whatever situations we come across with so much more ease and grace. I also watch how I talk to Lucky and even about him. Am I rehearsing the story to others that he's a rescue pup who is afraid of dogs and people? Yeah, I still catch myself doing that. But I do make a conscious effort to catch myself, and that's a difference. When he does something that I know is a challenge for him, like going into the water or stepping on a new texture that he's wary of, I always praise him, telling him how brave and confident he is instead of just saying, "good boy." I tell him good calm when he stays below threshold around a trigger. It might sound silly, but I think it's important to be specific. I treat him like I would another person, and I know that as I'm saying the words, I'm conveying an energy, a feeling that he picks up on. I extend this to also talking to him about what is happening. When we have to go to the vet, I talk to him calmly about what's going to happen to him. When I have to go out of town, I tell him how many sleeps I'm going to be gone and who's going to be taking care of him. When I'm going to use the vacuum cleaner or something else that bothers him, I tell him, and he then opts to go somewhere where he feels safe. And when I'm done, he comes back out. I tell him he's safe. I let him know what to expect, and I respect his right to know what is happening to him. In the animal communication world, we talk about this all of the time, about how in telling our animals what to expect, just as you would talk to a human, we help reassure them. And I've definitely noticed that Lucky is much calmer about things more generally as a result of me doing this. I've mentioned this before, but I've also found that hypnotherapy has been really helpful in supporting Lucky's anxiety. Now, before you completely dismiss this, hear me out. In Canine Flow, we learned to write a hypnotherapy script for something that we wanted to help our dog with. I decided to write one that focused on Lucky's reactivity to dogs and people when we're out on the walk. And just like a hypnotherapy script for a person, the idea is that it brings the dog into a relaxed state, and then you suggest what you'd like the dog to experience and how you might want to support behavior change. I led Lucky through a visualization of him having fun on a sunny beach, and how dogs and people actually make the walks really interesting for him because he loves to smell them on the path. I also suggested that if he feels anxious about them, that I'll support him in walking on by, or he can turn to me and I'll pick him up and we will walk calmly away together. The very next day after I first did this exercise, I had to take Lucky to the vet to have his nails clipped. Going to the vet and having his nails clipped usually brings on full-on panic response, like heavy panting, whining, shaking, pacing. He knows exactly where we're going when I make a particular turn, and from that point, he's in full panic mode. This particular time that we went, the day after I did the hypnotherapy session with him, he was nervous, but he wasn't panicking. He actually allowed the vet to cut his nails without any fuss, and she turned to me and said, "What did you do? He's a different dog." Now, I haven't been as consistent with this practice as I'd like, and so he has been panicky since, but I know that it's helped, and I've told myself that I need to come up with a more regular practice for him. I don't know how it works, but it does. I also think it's worth bringing up energy and practices you'll be familiar with, like the law of attraction and the law of assumption. I'm not talking about manifesting a car here, but I'm more referring to how what we focus on shapes our experiences of reality. In fact, many of the teachers of law of assumption talk about what we're experiencing as actually a filtering process, that everything is possible, and what we're seeing is what we have filtered into our reality. Even from a psychology perspective, we know that we experience what we focus on. It's called cognitive bias. Did you ever see that meme of two basketball teams on the court and a person in a gorilla costume walks through? When you're asked to focus on one of the basketball teams, you don't even see the gorilla. I mean, it's amazing. So how does this relate to Lucky? Well, I consciously notice all the small and large improvements that we make. Instead of just focusing on how many times he displayed reactive behavior on a walk, I instead focus on the one time that he disengaged. Or I focus on how he chooses to step on a new surface that he used to find challenging. The more I focus on the wins, the more wins we seem to have. So how do I know this is all working? Here's a litmus test for me. Not too long ago, Lucky let my friend Kate pet him. This might not seem like much of anything to you, but this had me in literal tears. If you've got a dog who struggles, I'm sure you can relate to this. This took over a year of working on. Lucky started out barking and lunging at Kate when we would run into her on our walks. Kate rides a bike, so this added to Lucky's maniacal reaction. But Kate was so considerate and would always get off the bike and walk it over before she got close to him. She would ignore him and let him come check her out in his own timing. She never, ever tried to pet him. When she would come over to our house, we sat outside and at first kept Lucky safe at a distance, then allowed Lucky to check her out and come in and out as he wanted. She would throw treats on the ground away from her and allow him choice in whether or not he ate the treats and whether or not he came to sniff her. Eventually, he started coming up to Kate very excitedly, but she still didn't try to pet him. Then, one day, he nudged her hand and asked for pets. And I teared up. He had never done that before. But Kate continued to take it at Lucky's pace. She consent tested every few seconds, allowing him the chance to decide if he wanted physical affection or not. She allowed things to go at Lucky's pace and allowed that pace to change without putting any pressure on him. And although we've made huge progress, I still had issues with Lucky snapping at Kate and my mom and even me when he's hit his threshold. I haven't cracked this nut, but we are making huge leaps and strides, and that's what I'm focusing on. And finally, here's something you may not have expected. I allowed myself to mourn the dog I thought I'd have, but I don't. I'm kind to myself and allow myself to say that sometimes my dog's a pain in the ass, and that there's a part of me that wishes I had that dog that you can go to the cafe with or go hiking with, or any of the other things that I envisioned before getting a dog. I tell myself it's okay that I'm sad that I don't have that with Lucky right now, and that I may never have it. And in allowing those feelings to be okay, I can also totally embrace Lucky and all of the wonderful gifts he brings to my life, in spite of and because of the very behaviors that make life a little bit more challenging than the life that I'd initially envisioned with my imaginary dog. I let Lucky be Lucky, instead of constantly weighing him up against what I think he should be. What a mirror, hey? I think self-compassion is so important in these cases, and I truly hope that you're showing yourself the grace and kindness that you deserve. So I know this has been a long one, so to recap, here's what I found has been helpful in Lucky's journey that you might be able to apply to your situation with your dog. First, taking a holistic approach and putting the pieces together to paint a fuller picture. It's never one thing that's the issue, and it's never one thing that's the solution. And the solution might lie in something that seems totally unrelated. Lucky's chewing on his ankle became a huge clue that something else was underlying his aggressive behavior, and seeking help in unexpected and unconventional ways ended up being the missing piece that we needed. Health check and diet. Behavior is linked to physical health as well as emotional health. So having your dog checked out as well as looking at the potential role of diet can go a long way. I personally find a DIY fresh diet the best way for me to support Lucky's health, in large part because it enables me to quickly identify possible intolerances. I've also found focusing on raw meaty bones has been so helpful for Lucky on a physical and emotional level. Find something that works for you and your dog. Consider what equipment might best help you and your dog navigate the world easily. I didn't mention it, but I definitely think muzzle training all dogs is so beneficial. And if using a muzzle with your dog helps you feel more confident, that will translate to your dog. Look at the environment, in and outside of the house, and look at what might be triggering or stifling to your dog in your everyday environment. What changes can you make to let your dog be a dog? Consider energy, your dog's energy, and how you can create practices that lift your energies. This will greatly impact how you're viewing, engaging with, and experiencing your dog. And remember to give yourself a sense of grace. You're doing an amazing job. And just a note, I still use operant training models with them, but I add in all the things I've mentioned because my focus is really on relationship building, more so than it is on changing Lucky's behavior. The more I build our relationship and our communication, the better we both are. One final note, and this is the importance of community. This is a huge reason that I started this podcast because we need community. We need to hear others' stories. We need to know that we're not alone, and we need others' support. When you have a dog that differs from society's ideal, it can feel isolating. and this can have a really detrimental impact on your dog's well-being and your own. Connect with others in your local community, connect with others online, and join us here in this Mystic Dog Mama community. You're not alone. Now that I've given you a bit of a rundown of my experience with Lucky, I'd love to know, was this helpful for you? Are there any particular things that stood out to you? Or are there any particular issues that you're having with your own dog that you'd like me to address with experts in a future episode? Let me know. You can reach me on Instagram at Mystic Dog Mama. And a huge thank you to Kelly for sending me this question. If you're enjoying the podcast, I would be so grateful if you would like it, subscribe it, rate it, and leave a review. If you're enjoying the podcast, I would be so grateful if you would like it, subscribe it, rate it, and leave a review. It means so much to me, and it makes the podcast easier to find for other Mystic Dog Mamas and Papas who are looking for different conversations around our journeys with our dogs. I was beyond honored and thrilled to see that Mystic Dog Mama recently made it to number 14 on Apple Podcasts in the UK in the Pets and Animals category. Thank you so much to all of you who are helping grow and build this community. It's just amazing, and I'm humbled beyond words. And remember, if you'd like to take advantage of a reduced rate nutrition consultation for a personalized diet plan for your pup, DM me on Instagram with the word nutrition, or email me at mysticdogmama@gmail.com, and I'll send you the link to the intake form. Again, I've left this in the show notes. Okay, until next time.